board. I'm on the move, actually working on a couple of new Nancy Guthrie stories. But in this episode, really, really interesting, I am digging into a couple of things. I'm talking to famed profiler, FBI profiler, Jim Clemente. First of all, he has a really detailed analysis of the blood spatter that was outside Nancy Guthrie's house. An analysis in a way that I haven't seen before, which I think you're going to find really, really interesting, and it really tells a story, he says. Also, what is the suspect or suspects in the Nancy Guthrie case? What are they thinking now? What sort of behavior are they exhibiting now, more than 2 months after the abduction? And how could that help people know what to look for in terms of tracking them down? Jim Clemente always just has such interesting analysis of these kinds of things because of his experience with the FBI as a profiler. You have been looking at with the blood spatter patterns, because I know you went back and analyzed the video that we were able to take up on the front porch area of Nancy's house. What stood out to you?
Well, first of all, it was great to actually get the video itself so I could do it frame by frame and then isolate some images, because blood spatter evidence, mainly because of the viscosity of blood, the nature of blood, tells us a story, and it is frozen in time. It's a particular moment in time that this happened. But if you look at the first image where there's two distinct blood spatter patterns, first of all, there are some very clear indications from that image. And on the one that's more in the center of the screen, you can see some larger droplets of blood and then some smaller droplets of blood. And then to the right of that, you see what looks like a smear pattern. And that is somebody disturbing blood that has already been transplanted onto that surface. So, like I said, it tells a story. But if you then go to, if we kind of, so as an overview, these two spatter patterns happen very close in time, right? And they indicate some action that happened in the middle of them. So you can go to the next picture. This is an image of, a still image of this, a little bit of a close-up of that center pattern that we saw in the top of the last screen. And this tells me a number of things, and it's very specific. One is that at this point, Nancy her face was very close to the ground, within a foot of the ground. And this could be either she was on her knees and hunched over, or just hunched over, or actually laying on the ground. But it looks less like she was laying on the ground, but more like hunched over this spot. And the reason I can tell you that is because some of these are low velocity blood spatters, and some are medium velocity blood spatters. We generally categorize them as low, medium, and high. The high velocity blood spatter are very tiny little, almost misty kind of droplets. And that happens only when blood is impacted for example, in a gunshot wound. But medium velocity can be impacted when, they can be created when somebody actually aspirates blood and then coughs it up. And there's two indicators of that here. One is the small size of many of these blood spatters. And the other are, at the top of this image, you can see three circular blood spots, but they're hollow. You see mainly the rings. And that's because there was actually air in that blood. There was bubbles, and the bubbles burst. And that's why you see just the ring. Okay, so this definitely came from her, for example, in a gunshot wound. But medium velocity can be impacted when, they can be created when somebody actually aspirates blood and then coughs it up. And there's two indicators of that here. One is the small size of many of these blood spatters. And the other are, at the top of this image, you can see three circular blood spots, but they're hollow. You see mainly the rings, and that's because there was actually air in that blood. There was bubbles, and the bubbles burst, and that's why you see just the ring. Okay, so this definitely came from her. She coughed it out. There's very little in terms of directionality in terms of the larger droplets, but the smaller droplets you can see some of them are longitudinal. They're like oblong, so that tells you the direction that the blood was moving when it hit this surface, and not all of them are, and that was caused by the fact that she coughed out this blood, and it kind of went out in a bunch of different directions. So I believe that this shows us a situation in which Nancy coughed up blood, some of which was sort of had maintained its integrity. Some of it was bubbles that popped. And it's really important to know that this indicates that she was likely within a foot of the ground. Her face, her mouth was within a foot of the ground, probably pointing almost straight down at this point. And so I would assume that meant that she was either hunched over completely or she was on her knees and hunched over. Either a smudge in which someone had interfered with or after the blood was deposited, touched on that spot and then moved it. And then in the large splotch that is directly to the right of that, a little bit higher, there is a little bit of a tail going to the right. And if you notice in one of the in the middle sort of circular one that had air trapped in it, that it was a bubble, you'll see that there's also sort of a tail that goes to the right. And then the one below that and to the right, you'll see that also seems to be. So I would say her body was to the left of this image, that's towards the front door, and her head was facing away from the front door here, but almost straight down. Do you have any questions about that?
The part where it almost looks like blood spray, like I guess that would make sense from coughing.
Right, that's the medium velocity. The coughing, coughing it has pretty high velocity in terms of movement, but it's nowhere near the velocity of, say, a gunshot wound, right? So that's why we call it medium velocity.
The bigger, I guess, I don't know if you'd call them droplets, and the ones you're talking about where it looks like an air kind of bubble, but then there's some where they look like kind of normal blood, right, bigger droplets. Do you think those are also coming from coughing, or is that a different injury?
No, I don't think it's a different injury. What I do believe is that it could be, it dripped out. So she may have coughed and then more dripped out afterwards. That's what it appears to be to me. And then if you go to the next image, which is directly to in that first image, it was directly to the right of that first image. And as you can see, the doormat is to the left of this image. There are some more captures of droplets of blood and then bubbles of blood. And you can see them in the top center. You have two droplets of blood and one bubble. And then in the bottom, to slightly to the left, you'll see one droplet and then one bubble. And then to the right side of it, you'll see a couple more bubbles, and then you see a smear pattern. And that is because the blood that was deposited there was then interfered with. Someone may have stepped on it, someone may have their hand or another body part may have contacted it and smeared it there. So I think if we go back to the first image that we were talking about, this tells a story of a snippet of time. And that is that at this point in time, that there's the highest likelihood is that she was either down on her knees or hunched over completely with her face very close to the ground and coughing out this blood. And then after that, where the blood pattern then disappears, I believe that she was likely picked up and carried the rest of the way, perhaps with her face up, so that there was no more blood deposited on that walkway. So, Brian, have you been able to confirm whether or not there was actually blood spatter patterns inside the house?
What I've been told is no, that the only blood is what we see outside the front door. There have been some other reports from other journalists that they're saying they have a source that there is blood right inside the door, like you see outside. But my source said no, like that's not the case. It's just outside. So that's
okay.
Well,
if there is blood spatter patterns on the inside of the door, that would indicate to me that she was, because of what Savannah told us, that her mother was taken out of her bed at night, right? I believe that she was threatened. She was controlled by, most likely, the gun that the offender had at his waist or his crotch area, and that he used the gun to threaten her, control her, and get her down to the front door. At that point, or shortly thereafter, she realized he was trying to take her out of the house. And like we definitely tell people, if an offender is trying to take you away from a location, he's trying to take you to a location where he has more privacy and control. And that never bodes well for the victim. That if an offender is trying to take you away from a location, then fight for your life with your life, because that's how dramatically your chances of survival diminish if someone is taking you away from a place where you were secure. So I believe that Nancy fought him either inside the door or just outside the door, depending on whether the first appearance of this blood spatter evidence is. And at that point, she was likely either blitzed with overwhelming force, punched in the face or the nose, and she began bleeding, and she went down either on her knees or just hunched over and then coughed up this blood, which is why we see this pattern. I think at that point, she was likely picked up by the offender, he or she having stepped in and smeared or another body part of hers touching the blood that she had coughed up already and smearing in the patterns that we see here. And then from that point forward, she was carried to whatever vehicle he had. And at that point, she was likely turned with her face up so that we see no further blood dripping from the face wounds that likely caused this pattern.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said. And I think last time you and I talked, then we talked once the recording was over, and you mentioned, we talked about, if someone tries to take you and put you in a car, should you ever get in? And I was saying, well, maybe you get in and then try to negotiate. You said, no, you never. I mean, obviously with Nancy, she's an older woman. She didn't probably have much control, but you're saying, like, for people watching, you fight to not get in the car, basically.
Right. I mean, it's rare, but when, for example, it happened just the other day, a young girl was, I think, walking home from school or waiting at her bus stop, and a man came up in a van, got behind her, put a gun to her back, and ordered her into the van. Luckily, other students saw this happen and called the police. The guy took her in the van and went to a gas station and for whatever reason brought her inside, and she mouthed the words, "Help me," to the clerk. The clerk got in between her and him and got him out of the store just as the police were arriving, and he was arrested. Now, that is a very rare set of circumstances. If there are people who witness you being taken away and can identify the offender, the license plate, whatever it is, you might have a larger chance of survival. But the fact that an offender is taking you to a place where they have more privacy and control, they literally are bringing you to a place where they have connections, and either they've been there before to surveil it, or this is someplace under their control. And both of those things mean that they might not want you to survive to be able to tell what happened and where it happened. So the best thing to do is use all your personal weapons, and that is biting someone, poking their eyes, ripping their ears off, whatever you have to do, kick them in the groin area, whatever you have to do, scream and scratch and fight, to do everything possible to not being taken into a place where they have more custody and control of you.
Do you think that there was more than, I mean, you've said before you thought this was one person. Do you still believe that, or do you think there may have been more?
Yeah, I think this actually indicates to me a single actor, because we don't see multiple steps through this blood spatter evidence. And if there were two people, let's say, you would think that one of them would have had control of her, complete control of her inside the house, and brought her outside and would not have lost that control. But here she's clearly on the ground, coughing this blood up. And I believe if this is the only place where there's blood, this must be where she was attacked. And that must mean that she had just fought him at that point, and that was used to then control her. And then from that point, she was then lifted and taken away, which is why you don't see any other blood spatter evidence.
What does it say about the person that they would hurt an older 84-year-old woman like that? And maybe I'm just naive, because I don't know, all of this is hard for me to wrap my mind around, like punching an old lady, you know, but to me, I'd have a much easier time like punching you and hurting you. The thought of like doing that to an old woman is like, I can't even imagine. I'd rather just run away and abandon the whole plan, you know?
Right. Well, it just tells you a little bit more about his motivation, that there was a goal in mind and he was going to do whatever it took to accomplish that goal. And here it appears that that goal had to do with getting Nancy out of her home in the middle of the night. What else he planned on doing, we have no idea. Now, this goes back to the whole ransom note issue. If one or more of those ransom notes was real, and if it was
automatically visible, someone with technical knowledge can structure transactions in ways that make tracing difficult, though not impossible. Law enforcement has developed sophisticated methods for tracking cryptocurrency, and the FBI has successfully traced Bitcoin payments in numerous cases. But from a criminal's perspective, it's still safer than asking for cash drops or wire transfers that create immediate, traceable connections. The suspect clearly had enough technical knowledge to set up a Bitcoin wallet and communicate the account information. That requires some level of digital literacy, access to the internet, an understanding of how cryptocurrency works. It's not highly sophisticated, but it's beyond what someone with no technical capability could manage. This creates an interesting profile element. He's tech-aware enough to use Bitcoin, but not experienced enough to understand that sending ransom notes to the media defeats the purpose of cryptocurrency's anonymity. He's made himself a public figure in a highly publicized case, while trying to use a payment method designed for privacy. What happened with that Bitcoin account is where Nancy Guthrie's story takes its darkest turn. In just the last week, journalists learned details that weren't previously public. On February 10th, someone deposited funds into the Bitcoin account. The amount was described as small, likely a gesture to demonstrate willingness to pay, rather than the full ransom amount. Along with the deposit came a message. Those exact words matter. "We are ready to talk, contact us." This was either the Guthrie family or the FBI establishing contact, showing good faith and trying to open a negotiation channel. In any ransom situation, proof of life is the critical first step. Before substantial money changes hands, the paying party needs evidence that the victim is alive and will be returned. That evidence can be a recent photograph, a video, a phone call, answers to questions only the victim would know. Without proof of life, there's no reason to pay, because there's no guarantee the victim is even alive or that paying will result in their return. The message in that Bitcoin account was an invitation to provide that proof. We're ready to talk. We're willing to pay. Show us Nancy is alive, and let's negotiate. No response came. The Bitcoin account went silent. Days passed. Weeks passed. More than 2 months have now elapsed since Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, and that account has shown no further activity. The deposited funds sit untouched. The message remains unanswered. And Jim Clementi's professional assessment is as grim as it is logical. If Nancy was alive, and the suspect's goal was truly financial, there's absolutely no reason not to respond to people offering money. The failure to provide proof of life, the failure to engage with willing payers, the complete communication breakdown, all of it points to one terrible conclusion. Nancy Guthrie was likely already deceased by the time that money was deposited, and that message was sent. Think about the timeline. Nancy was taken in the middle of the night. She fought at her doorstep and was punched hard enough to cause significant facial trauma and internal bleeding. She was carried to a vehicle bleeding from the nose and mouth. Whatever happened after that, whether she was transported to a secondary location, whether she died from her injuries, whether the situation escalated beyond what the suspect planned, something went catastrophically wrong. By February 10th, when someone reached out ready to negotiate, the suspect couldn't deliver what any successful ransom required. He couldn't prove Nancy was alive, because she almost certainly wasn't. That silence is what separates amateur criminals from experienced ones. A professional would have either maintained control of the situation and completed the transaction, or would have cut losses and disappeared before leaving this much evidence behind. This suspect did neither. He created a public spectacle with media ransom notes, set up a payment method, and then went silent when actual money became available. That's the behavior of someone who lost control of the situation and panicked. That's someone realizing the crime went further than intended and the stakes became too high to continue. Right now, that suspect is living with the knowledge of what he did. According to Clemente's behavioral analysis, he's asking himself 3 questions constantly. Did I actually get away with this? Was I able to permanently conceal her body? Will they be able to tie this to me? Those questions consume amateur criminals in ways that experienced offenders don't experience. Professional criminals have usually developed psychological compartmentalization or rationalization that allows them to separate themselves emotionally from their crimes. Amateurs haven't built those defenses yet. They're experiencing the full weight of what they've done, combined with the constant fear of getting caught. That fear manifests in predictable behaviors. He's watching every piece of coverage about Nancy Guthrie, every news report, every social media post, every online article. He's monitoring to see if investigators are getting close, if witnesses have come forward, if evidence has been announced. This obsessive consumption of case-related media is common among offenders, especially those who involved the media directly, like this suspect did by sending ransom notes to television stations. He's probably watching the very coverage he helped create, seeing Nancy's daughter Savannah make public pleas, watching law enforcement press conferences, tracking every development. He may be talking to people about the case. This seems counterintuitive, but it's actually common behavior. Offenders will bring up the case in conversation with friends, family, or co-workers to gauge what others know and think. They'll offer opinions about what they think happened or who might be responsible. They're fishing for information about whether they're under suspicion, while simultaneously trying to establish themselves as just another concerned community member following a local crime story. In some cases, they'll even criticize the investigation or the victim's family as a way of deflecting attention or managing their own guilt and anxiety. He's almost certainly changed his appearance. Different hairstyle, facial hair grown or shaved, change in clothing style or glasses. Physical appearance alteration is one of the first moves criminals make after committing a highly publicized crime. If he had long hair, he's probably cut it. If he was clean-shaven, he may have grown a beard. If he wore distinctive clothing or accessories, he's probably adopted a completely different look. These changes serve two purposes. They reduce the chance of being recognized based on surveillance footage or witness descriptions, and they provide a psychological sense of control. Changing appearance feels like taking action, like creating distance between who you were during the crime and who you are now. The vehicle he used is likely gone or significantly altered. Jim Clemente mentioned Rex Hoyerman, the accused Long Island serial killer who sold his Chevrolet Avalanche, the vehicle believed to have been used in his crimes to get rid of evidence. Criminals understand that vehicles can be traced through license plates, surveillance cameras, automated license plate readers, and witness sightings. If the suspect in Nancy's case owned the vehicle he used, he's probably sold it by now. If it was borrowed or rented, he's probably trying to ensure it can't be connected to him. If selling wasn't possible, he may have altered its appearance with new paint, removed distinctive features, or changed license plates. There's another possibility Clemente raised. The suspect may have left town, not permanently fleeing, which would draw attention and potentially trigger suspicion, but a temporary absence disguised as something legitimate, a family emergency in another state, a work opportunity requiring relocation, anything that provides plausible explanation for why he's not around during the most intense period of the investigation. This creates geographic distance from the crime scene and reduces the chance of saying something incriminating or being in a place that raises questions. After weeks or months, when media attention has decreased and investigative pressure has subsided somewhat, he might return, believing the danger has passed. But the danger hasn't passed. It's actually intensifying. The mistakes this suspect made during the crime, before the crime, and after the crime are the exact type that lead to arrests. The DNA-shedding face mask means genetic material was left throughout Nancy's home. Every surface he touched, every step he took, potentially every breath he took while wearing that mask deposited his DNA. Modern forensic technology can extract viable DNA profiles from increasingly small samples. Touch DNA, which is genetic material left behind from skin cells during normal contact with objects, has become a powerful investigative tool. The DNA profile, once developed by investigators, becomes the key to solving this case through forensic genetic genealogy. This is the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer, who had evaded capture for decades. Investigators upload the suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases, where millions of people have submitted their own DNA, seeking information about ancestry and relatives. The database identifies people who share genetic markers with the suspect, indicating they're related. Genealogists then build family trees, working backward and forward through generations to identify possible suspects who match the age, location, and other characteristics of the offender. This process has revolutionized cold case investigations and has proven especially effective in cases where the suspect has no prior criminal record and therefore isn't in law enforcement DNA databases. Even if this suspect has never been arrested, even if his DNA has never been collected by police, if any of his relatives have used commercial DNA testing services, investigators can potentially identify him. The genetic net is wide and getting wider every day as more people submit DNA for ancestry testing, without realizing they're potentially helping solve crimes committed by their relatives. The distinctive Walmart backpack with reflective straps is another investigative thread. Walmart has extensive surveillance camera systems in their stores. If investigators can determine when and where that specific backpack was purchased, they can review footage and potentially identify the buyer. Walmart also maintains transaction records. If the backpack was purchased with a credit card or debit card, that transaction creates a direct link to identity. Even if it was a cash purchase, surveillance footage of the transaction, parking lot cameras showing the vehicle the buyer arrived in, and timeline analysis of when that particular backpack model was available, in which stores can all narrow the investigative focus. The suspect's pre-attack surveillance almost certainly left additional evidence. Jim Clemente emphasized that this wasn't a random crime. The suspect knew Nancy lived alone. He knew she was elderly and vulnerable. He knew or believed her daughter Savannah had money and would be willing to pay for her mother's return. That information came from somewhere. Either he had some prior connection to the family, or he spent time conducting surveillance, watching the house, learning the patterns of when people came and went, confirming Nancy was alone at night. That surveillance might have been captured on neighborhood security cameras. Ring doorbells, home security systems, even traffic cameras might have recorded the same vehicle or the same person passing by Nancy's house multiple times in the days or weeks before the abduction. Investigators review footage from a wide time frame and geographic area, looking for patterns, for vehicles or individuals that appear repeatedly without obvious reason. One neighborhood camera might not tell the story, but 10 cameras showing the same car driving slowly past Nancy's house over several days creates a pattern that demands investigation. The suspect may have had a tangential connection that seemed innocent at the time, but gave him access to critical information. Pool service, yard maintenance, delivery drivers, rideshare drivers, even utility workers who came to the house for legitimate reasons would have had opportunity to observe that Nancy lived alone, to see the layout of the property, to identify potential entry points. Investigators interview everyone who had any service relationship with the household, reviewing contracts, work orders, delivery records. They look for people who were at the house and whose behavior afterward raised questions, who stopped showing up to work, who suddenly moved, who changed their appearance or sold their vehicle. There's also the possibility of a stalking motive directed not at Nancy, but at her daughter, Savannah. Savannah Guthrie worked at Court TV before joining her more famous cousin at NBC. She has her own public profile and career. Stalkers build elaborate fantasies about public figures, believing they have special connections, or that the target should pay attention to them. When those fantasies aren't validated, when the target doesn't respond the way the stalker believes they should, stalkers can escalate to violence, not necessarily against the target directly, but against people the target loves. Taking Nancy could have been a way to force Savannah's attention, to create a situation where she had to acknowledge the offender's existence, had to listen to his demands, had to respond. If that was the motive, the ransom notes to media outlets make more sense. The point wasn't really the money. The point was seeing Savannah's pain broadcast publicly, watching her make pleas on television, knowing he had created this situation and forced her to react. The fact that he never responded to the Bitcoin payment offer supports this theory. He already got what he wanted by February 10th. He'd seen weeks of coverage, seen Savannah's anguish, felt the power of having orchestrated all of it. Actually, collecting money and returning Nancy was never really the goal. The goal was the attention, the pain, the demonstration of power. Whether the motive was financial or psychological, or some combination of both, the outcome for Nancy appears to have been the same. The silence from the suspect after the Bitcoin message suggests strongly that she had already died. The question that haunts investigators and the Guthrie family is where, if Nancy died from the injuries sustained during the struggle at her front door, if the punch to her face caused complications that proved fatal during transport, or shortly after, her body could be anywhere along the route from her home. If she was taken to a secondary location and died there, or was killed there, that location becomes the crime scene investigators need to find. The suspect's efforts to conceal Nancy's body reveal his level of planning and criminal sophistication. If the body is well hidden, if it's in a location that required significant effort or knowledge to access, that suggests premeditation and planning beyond the abduction itself. If the body is in a location connected to the suspect, like property he owns or has access to, that creates a direct evidentiary link once investigators identify him. The absence of Nancy's body being found after more than 2 months could mean it's very well concealed, or it could mean investigators simply haven't searched the right location yet. Finding remains becomes a priority not just for bringing closure to the family, but for building the strongest possible criminal case. A body provides forensic evidence that strengthens prosecution. Cause of death, time of death, additional DNA evidence, trace evidence like fibers or soil that can connect the suspect to the location. Without a body, prosecutors can still bring murder charges based on other evidence, but cases with remains are typically stronger and easier to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The emotional toll on Savannah Guthrie and her family is almost unimaginable. Unlike cases where a body is found and there's terrible closure, Savannah exists in a state of limbo. She doesn't know for certain what happened to her mother. She doesn't know who's responsible. She doesn't know if that person poses a danger to her or her own family. She's returned to work, trying to maintain some normalcy, but carrying the weight of not knowing, of waiting, of hoping against hope while facing the likely reality that her mother is gone. The Maricopa County Sheriff expressed concern that the person who did this could strike again. That concern is based on the reality that someone who successfully abducts one person might feel emboldened to try again, especially if they believe they've gotten away with it. However, Jim Clemente's profile suggests this suspect probably hasn't done this before and probably won't do it again. The mistakes he made, the lack of criminal sophistication, the way the situation spiraled beyond his control, all of it points to someone for whom this was likely a first attempt at this type of crime. There's a possibility this represents an escalation from lesser offenses. Serial criminals typically don't start with kidnapping and murder. They start with precursor crimes that are less serious, but feed the same psychological needs. In cases that eventually involve abduction, those precursor crimes often include peeping, breaking into homes when no one is there, stealing personal items, escalating to confronting victims. If this suspect has a history of those types of offenses in Nancy's neighborhood or in other areas, connecting those earlier crimes to this case could provide additional evidence and help identify him. The question of whether he'll strike again depends partly on whether Nancy's death was intended. If he meant to take her, collect ransom, and return her, but she died accidentally from injuries or complications, he's probably terrified and unlikely to try again. If he meant to kill her from the beginning, if the ransom was always a cover story and the real motive was something darker, the risk of reoffending increases. But even in that scenario, the publicity of this case, the investigative resources dedicated to it, and the suspect's awareness that he's being hunted all serve as deterrents to attempting another crime. Law enforcement professionals like Jim Clemente understand that family members in Savannah's position often become frustrated with the pace of investigation. When you're living the nightmare daily, when every moment is consumed with questions and fear and grief, it can feel like investigators aren't moving fast enough or doing enough. Savannah's background as a lawyer and her work covering crime for court TV means she has more knowledge than most family members about how investigations work. That knowledge could be helpful in understanding the process, but it could also make her more critical when progress seems slow. Professional investigators understand this dynamic and continue doing their work regardless of how families react. The goal isn't to manage family emotions. The goal is to find justice. That means following every lead, processing every piece of evidence, building the strongest possible case so that when an arrest is made, prosecution can succeed. That work continues day after day, even when there's nothing new to report publicly, even when family members are angry or frustrated, even when years pass without visible progress. Cases like the Colonial Parkway murders in Virginia demonstrate how long justice can take, but also how persistence pays off. Multiple couples were murdered along the Colonial Parkway over several years, starting in the late 1980s. Decades passed with no arrests, despite intensive investigation. Then advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to connect murders that hadn't been definitively linked before and to develop profiles that could be run through genealogy databases. Slowly, answers emerged. Suspects were identified. Some cases were solved 30 years after the murders occurred. The families who waited decades for those answers showed remarkable resilience. but they also suffered through years of not knowing, of false hope and dead ends and frustration. Savannah Guthrie faces the possibility of a similar weight, though modern technology and the publicity of her mother's case may speed the timeline considerably. The publicity is a double-edged sword. It keeps pressure on investigators and keeps the case in public consciousness, which can generate tips and keep resources allocated to the investigation. But it also means Savannah's grief is public. Her trauma is broadcast, and she can't process what's happened privately the way most people can. Victim services and counseling become essential for surviving this kind of trauma. Professional support helps family members develop coping mechanisms, process complicated emotions, and maintain functioning even while carrying tremendous pain. Savannah's decision to return to work is actually consistent with how many trauma survivors cope. Structure, routine, and purpose help create stability when everything else feels chaotic and out of control. Work provides distraction, gives the mind something to focus on besides the worst possibilities, and creates a sense of normalcy even when nothing is normal. The resolution of Nancy Guthrie's case will likely come from one of several investigative paths. DNA evidence, processed through forensic genetic genealogy, could identify the suspect through family connections. Someone who knows the suspect could come forward with information, either because they've noticed behavioral changes or because the suspect said something incriminating before or after the crime. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood, from businesses, from traffic cameras could provide images that lead to vehicle or suspect identification. Tips from the public generated by media coverage could provide the piece of information investigators need. Or the suspect himself could make another mistake, could be arrested for something else, could try to sell evidence, could return to the scene. Any action that brings him to law enforcement attention. What's certain is that the evidence already collected creates a strong foundation for prosecution once a suspect is identified. The DNA throughout Nancy's house provides genetic proof of presence. The blood evidence on the front porch tells the story of what happened during those moments of struggle. The Bitcoin account creates a digital trail of ransom demands and attempted communication. The distinctive backpack provides a physical object that can be traced. Surveillance footage from various sources can place vehicles and individuals in locations at specific times. All of these pieces exist now, waiting to be connected to a name, to a face, to an arrest. The suspect knows this. He knows evidence exists. He knows investigators are working the case. He knows every day that passes without arrest is another day closer to the moment when everything falls apart. That psychological pressure builds over time. Amateur criminals don't handle it well. They get paranoid. They start seeing connections that aren't there. They wonder if people are looking at them differently. They second-guess every decision they made during the crime. They lose sleep. They make more mistakes. Those mistakes compound. Maybe they search online for information about the case using devices that can be traced. Maybe they tell someone they trust, and that person eventually tells someone else. Maybe they return to locations connected to the crime for reasons they don't fully understand themselves. Maybe they change their appearance so dramatically that people notice and wonder why. Each mistake creates another potential pathway for investigators to follow. Nancy Guthrie fought back on her front porch. At 84 years old, she resisted being taken from her home. She paid for that resistance with violence that likely ended her life. But her resistance also created evidence. The blood she left behind tells her story. The fight she put up disrupted the suspect's plan and potentially caused him to make additional mistakes. Her courage in those final moments might be what ultimately leads to justice. The investigation continues. Evidence is processed. Tips are followed up. Surveillance footage is reviewed frame by frame. DNA databases are searched. Family trees are built. Somewhere in all of that work is the answer to who took Nancy Guthrie and where she is now. The walls are closing in. The mistakes have been made. And eventually, the silence will be broken by an arrest. This case represents everything we cover here at Revealing Untold Crimes. The intersection of forensic science and human tragedy. The profiling work that helps us understand not just what happened, but why. The determination of families seeking justice, and the investigative persistence that refuses to let cases go cold. If you want to follow the Nancy Guthrie case as it develops, if you want expert analysis of the evidence and the psychology behind crimes like this, subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes right now. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people who might have information. Share this with anyone who follows true crime, because the more eyes on cases like Nancy's, the more likely someone will recognize something important and come forward. We're going to stay on this case until there's resolution. We're going to continue bringing you the facts, the evidence, and the expert insights that mainstream coverage misses. Nancy Guthrie deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. And we're going to be here covering every step until they get both.